Yes, we register our awareness of slavery's legacies and our disagreements over reparations, racial balance, discrimination, incarceration rates, rap music, the meaning of the civil rights movement, all that. Yet historical memory encourages us to believe that we should celebrate slavery's permanent demise. Emancipation's vicious aftermath, which African Americans most certainly do remember, but most of the rest of us don't, lynching, sharecropping, race riots, the KKK, segregation, rarely tempers these positive impressions. And inadvertently, media productions such as Glory, Amistad, the Ken Burns Civil War series, they all attest to a national narrative of slavery that's reassuring in its familiarity. We all know it. And it's focused on the struggles of the enslaved and the triumphant moment in which slavery is abolished. The National Park Service is active all over the nation in documenting and interpreting under our railroad sites and inspiring cameos of Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman enrich our textbooks and adorn our postage stamps. It's all become part of our national folklore to incorporate this story in generally this way. In high academic circles, historians like me have constructed incontrovertible accounts of slaveholders' exploitation, the slaves' resistance, and the abolitionists' agitation. Many of these same scholars have become familiar as talking heads on PBS and the History Channel. The popular culture tells a story that doesn't allow us to see the story about the present that we really need to see. Clear? Good. These examples can be multiplied, but the point should be clear. Our accounts of our history, well-founded as they are, I'm not contesting any of this. Well, yeah, I sort of am. Do not prepare us to understand today's slavery. It makes it all but impossible for Americans who conflate black with bondage to comprehend far-flung systems of enslavement that are ensnaring people of every imaginable pigmentation. White sex slaves in Chechnya, as well as yellow sex slaves in Bangkok, red wood cutters in Manaus, Brazil, brown carpet weavers in Bangalore, black diamond miners in Angola, or any with the above skin tones enslaved in Providence. And all the other contrasts just cited, and it's easy to understand why the moral crisis of contemporary slavery eludes us. But for all those unnoticed heroes who, far out of the headlines, have taken abolition as their religious mission, or who work for freedom through secular NGOs, all these groups that we can't name, who are all out there, slavery exists for us in a parallel universe to the slavery that we're familiar with. Okay. In the face of these obstacles, how can I suggest that the times are right to launch a new abolitionist movement? I can, I believe, for two reasons. And there goes my podium again. First, because of demographics. Demographics in the United States are changing in ways that fundamentally undermine our instinct to overlook slavery. The world I just described is not the world we're going to live in. Second, and closely related, the nation is well along, I'm a very optimistic guy, into a period of religious and political revitalization, particularly among its younger citizens. I'm talking about this millennial generation that I referred to earlier, which I think is redolent with latent abolitionist opportunity. These are developments that are surprisingly comparable. Now, here's where my role as a historian and my role as an advocate begin to try and come together and not conflict with each other in some intellectually irresponsible way. These are developments that are surprisingly comparable to trends that characterize our nation in the 1830s, the decade that birthed the original radical abolitionist movement. A few more quick comparisons between then and now suggest that the moment may well have arrived in which we can choose to become 21st century radical abolitionists. History most surely doesn't repeat itself, yet for all their inexactness, some of the parallels argue for our capacity to emulate the original abolitionists. Still with me? Others invite us to move decisively beyond their example. The primary objective in either case is to relieve white Americans of their blindness to contemporary slavery. We need to begin to see who these people are. If we are to witness the birth of a new abolitionist movement, there's no alternative but to learning how to see. Lesson number one from the past. Demand the impossible and know precisely that this is what you're doing. nevertheless mean it irrevocably and act on it absolutely. This axiom has nothing to do with the labor union tactic of asking for the maximum and then bargaining downward. It means instead that we should embrace a lifelong promise to make war against a morally indefensible system that is deeply entrenched. Easy to say, hard to do. I'll try and talk about the hard to do in just a minute. That is deeply entrenched, aggressively expanding, and exceedingly powerful. It's much bigger than we are. That's what the antebellum abolitionists did. Knowing that the slavery in their day represented the economy's second largest capital asset, real estate was the first, that slaveholders dominated the nation's governance, and that the vast majority of the nation's white people supported slavery and loathed black people, they nevertheless always called for immediate, unconditional, and uncompensated emancipation. They demanded that every single one of 3 million enslaved people be liberated at once, no strings attached. We can see in retrospect that this approach made sense. It certainly would make sense now given the intimidating size of slavery today. Who today would argue for the effectiveness of Thomas Jefferson's vague plan back then for diffusing gradually emancipated blacks across supposedly unoccupied Western territories, or the American Colonization Society's programs of emancipating slaves piecemeal and transporting them to West Africa? Would piecemeal opposition to slavery work today? I think the question answers itself, no. Immediatism, by contrast, always raises hackles, dislodges complacency, and challenges everybody to take a position and to act. Immediatism also seals deep personal commitments. It transforms one's spiritual condition, which explains why the antebellum abolitionist movement set an unsurpassed 4-decade endurance record. It's the longest-lasting social movement in our history. Immediatism thus ensures that our new abolitionist movement would remain active for a very long time and generate a powerful legacy. In this respect, its effect would be very much like the born-again conversion experience that has always been so central to evangelical Protestantism. You notice there's an awful lot of evangelical Protestantism in the United States right this minute. We'll be talking about that a little bit more in a minute. But here we also must be clear about another salient fact of abolitionist history. Significant numbers of non-evangelicals and anti-evangelicals, Unitarians, unreconstructed Calvinists, deists, skeptics, freethinkers, and transcendentalists, along with notable evangelicals, embraced immediatism together. For their time, and actually for any time, the original abolitionists created an exceptionally inclusive movement. So to be successful in our ever more pluralistic political culture, any new movement must do likewise. And I'll give you more on that in just a second. Finally, immediatism redefines politics. In the face of this demand, previously unrecognized problems that can be disturbingly linked to slavery suddenly take on unprecedented urgency. Slavery in turn becomes all the more difficult to countenance. In Garrison's day, male and female activists quickly equated the slavery of color with the slavery of sex and invented women's rights. Factory workers condemned wages slavery and organized the first labor movements. As the Civil War drew closer, politicians otherwise unsympathetic to abolitionism grew ever more distressed at slavery's potential to enslave an entire nation by crushing white Americans' prospects for upward mobility. Today's immediatism would likewise provoke us to see slavery more clearly by simultaneously seeing beyond it. It is not at all impossible to imagine that today's immediatists would quickly begin to identify slavery with other causes that desperately need greater visibility. Our rapidly growing homeless and prison populations. The stunning percentage of the world's population that subsists on less than $1 a day. The dive of global wages everywhere downward.